Today, we're in a world where there's 400 or more false prophets all around us, whispering the different words, the things that we want to hear. Just because you graduated from seminary, went on a mission, got sealed in the temple, doesn't mean you can coast. We can resist true prophets, try to disguise our disobedience, or we can listen to the prophets and follow their teachings. The crowd might never applaud our choice to follow God, but it doesn't really matter what they think. The only approval that counts is the Lord's. A few years ago in France, an elderly woman was moving into a retirement home. And so she called an auctioneer to see if she had anything of value that she could sell as part of her moving process. Well, hanging above her stove was a small painting that she'd always thought of as just an old decoration. But experts discovered that this little panel was actually a medieval masterpiece. It was purchased by the Louvre for more than $26 million. What looked like something ordinary turned out to be a forgotten treasure. And I wonder if we could see that in Chronicles. Because most of us flip past Chronicles thinking, oh, it's just a repeat of Samuel and Kings. In fact, the Greek word for Chronicles means things omitted or things left out. So a bully on the Bible playground might call the Chronicles the leftovers. But what can seem like a forgotten book is one of the Bible's greatest masterpieces. Just like 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings were both one book, 1st and 2nd Chronicles was originally one book as well. Each of these books were separated just for more convenience with the scroll length. Now, we don't know who wrote Chronicles, he or they. We sometimes refer to them as the chronicler. But Chronicles tells the very long story from Adam all the way down to Cyrus and the Jews being set free from Babylonian captivity. And when you look at it as a cohesive work, it's really beautiful. Let's step back and look at the big picture. So the first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles are a series of long genealogies showing how God's people are connected all the way back to Adam. And honestly, this is where a lot of us just decide, you know what, I'm going to skip Chronicles. But if we keep reading, we find that the next 20 chapters are the story of David. Now, the chronicler has a very different perspective than the author of Kings. The chronicler wants to only highlight the best parts of David's life. So a lot of the tough things in David's life are omitted. When we get to 2 Chronicles, the first 10 or so chapters are about David's son Solomon building the temple and praying for wisdom. And then the final 25 chapters or so are about the history of the kings of Judah, from Solomon's son Rehoboam all the way to the fall of Jerusalem and the people's return from the exile. Now, unlike Kings, which bounces back and forth between the northern kingdom of the 10 tribes and the southern kingdom of Judah, Chronicles just focuses on the people of Judah. If you remember the overview that we've been using throughout this course, the bulk of Chronicles takes place roughly from the time period of around 1000 BC through 540 BC. But for our purposes today, we'll focus on 5 stories from the book of Chronicles that take place from roughly 900 to 700 BC. And 4 of these 5 stories aren't in the King's narrative. They're only found in Chronicles. We'll see the stories of Asa's weakness, Jehoshaphat's power prayer, Micaiah and the false prophets, Hezekiah's great Passover, and Hezekiah's tunnel. These are lesser known stories that can change your life. So let's start with Asa's weakness. Asa is the great-grandson of Solomon. He's living about the year 900 BC. And while he was king, an army of 1 million Ethiopians attacked the kingdom of Judah. Judah is completely outnumbered. There's no hope. Asa turns to God in prayer, says, "Help us, O Lord, our God, for we rely on you." The Lord heard Asa's plea, and Asa and his people are miraculously victorious. For the next 20 years, the people of Judah are living in peace, but this period comes to an end because of Asa's changing attitude towards the Lord. Later, when an opposing army threatens to invade, Asa sends a letter to the king of Syria, along with a bunch of treasure that he's taken from the temple, and he says, "Please, king of Syria, come help us." He used to rely on the Lord. Now he's relying on the king of Syria. A prophet came to Asa and said, "Were not the Ethiopians a huge army with very many chariots and horsemen? Yet because you relied on the Lord, he gave them into your hand. Now, by turning to the Syrians, you have done foolishly. From now on, you will have wars." Do you see why Asa is being criticized? He's shifting where he places his trust. Later, Asa faced a personal crisis. Asa was diseased in his feet, and his disease became severe. Now, if you have severe health challenges, there are two things you should do, right? You're going to get medical help. You're also going to seek a blessing. But in his disease, Asa did not seek the Lord, but sought help from the physicians. It's not like it was bad to seek help from the physicians. It was that he didn't turn to the Lord. So I want us to visualize in our own lives where we put our trust. And I want to use this diagram here that I call the trust matrix. As you can see on the y-axis, at the bottom we have do nothing, and at the top is cheerfully do all things that lie in our power. On the far left side of the x-axis is trust in self, and on the far right is trust in God. So there's 4 different quadrants. Now, let's explore each of these quadrants briefly. Is it possible, if you trust in God and do nothing, is it possible to have success? It's possible, right? Sometimes God is merciful. Can you trust in yourself, do nothing, and have success? Not very likely, but it's possible, right? Maybe you just get super lucky. How about the upper left-hand corner? Do people find success as they trust in themselves and work hard? This is a common area of success. It is, however, a very stressful place to live. I think you'll agree with me that the sweet spot is the upper right-hand corner. This is where we're working as if everything depended on us, praying as if everything depended on God. It's the sweet spot. Now, Asa, earlier in his life, he was in this upper right-hand corner. But later he began to rely on himself and others. It's like we've already seen throughout our time together in the Old Testament. It's a strong start, but a weak finish. Just because you graduated from seminary, went on a mission, got sealed in the temple, doesn't mean you can coast. Asa tells us that our trust in the Lord can shift over time, both in positive and negative directions. So consider your own life. Where do you see yourself on the trust matrix? And maybe think about different areas in your life. Maybe in your work life, you're in a different place than you are in your relationship life. We can be in different spots on the matrix depending on what part of our lives we're thinking about. Now, we're going to continue our discussion of the trust matrix, but first, let's look at an experience from the life of Asa's son, Jehoshaphat. And yes, Jehoshaphat is a real name. So he's king for about 25 years, from roughly 875 to 850 BC. And while Jehoshaphat is king, 3 separate nations unite together to attack Jerusalem. By the time Jehoshaphat has heard about it, these 3 nations have united in En-Gedi, which is just about 25 miles from Jerusalem. There's no hope for the people of Judah. So Jehoshaphat starts a fast and sincerely proclaims to God, "We have no might against this great company that cometh against us. Neither know we what to do, but our eyes are upon you." I hope as you're reading the Old Testament in your own studies that you are looking for and marking one-liners. This is such a powerful phrase. When your back is to the wall, when you don't know what to do, to turn to God and say, "Our eyes are on you." And after Jehoshaphat prayed, there was a divine response. "Be not afraid." That's another great one-liner. "For the battle is not yours, but God's. Tomorrow ye shall not need to fight in this battle. Stand ye still and see the salvation of the Lord with you." So on the day of the battle, the 3 nations started fighting amongst themselves, and they wound up killing each other off, and the people of Judah actually got all of the spoils from the war. Jehoshaphat learned what it means to stand still. And that reminds me of a passage in the Doctrine and Covenants. In section 123, we read, "Let us cheerfully do all things that lie in our power, and then may we stand still with the utmost assurance to see the salvation of God and for his arm to be revealed." And I think this story and this passage give us a clue as to how to get to where we need to be on the trust matrix. If you're a part of this class today, you're probably not part of the group that's down here doing nothing, but maybe some of us are in the do nothing area, the lower half of the trust matrix. Maybe I need to spend less time scrolling and more time studying. But for many of us, the problem is not that we're down here, but we're up here. We're off the charts. And notice that in this visualization, there's a finite point on the y-axis. There's a certain maximum of all things that you can do. And some of us are trying to do more than that because we're worrying and stressing about things that are out of our control. This is where I often am in my life. And what I'm learning is there's so much more peace that can come where if instead of trying to get from 99% to 100% of all I can do, I spend less time on that and more time in prayer. We can especially trust in God when we are filled with fear. I love what the psalmist said, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. Sometimes we do need to work harder, but sometimes we actually need to stand still and let God do his work. We build that trust in him by spending more time on our knees. So again, think about where you are on the trust matrix in various areas of your life. Maybe you're already in the upper right-hand corner. You're doing great. Awesome. Just stay there. But if you're not, what would it take in your life for you to move into that upper right-hand corner?
I think that sometimes I feel like God is giving me the responsibility to do certain things by myself. And I don't think there's anything wrong with just letting him know what's going on and asking, but then continuing to try to do everything that I can do.
So it seems like maybe in some areas of your life, it's more like you feel like I've got to do everything in my power, and then maybe I could trust a little more.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Back when my youngest son was playing football, he must have been in 6th grade, he wore his jersey to the Friday night football game that he had to play in the next day. And he took it off, lost it that Friday, and he had no jersey to wear for the game on Saturday morning. And so lots of phone calls trying to figure out how does he still get to play. Long story short, he needed to just have the same number on his jersey. And so having other children that play football, I set about trying to sew the right number on an old jersey and cut and paste and everything. Meanwhile, my son prayed for help to find his jersey or a jersey or something. And my other son was like, hey, you know what? I think I have a practice jersey with that number in my closet. And so it was interesting to see how they were more in the upper right-hand quadrant when I was like, oh, we got to figure this ourselves. It's nice to see that when you put your trust in God, he can make the miracle happen in whatever circumstance there is.
Thank you. So I hope that this will be a helpful framework to think about in our lives of how can we deepen our trust? How can we get to that point where I'm willing to surrender control to him? Now, our next story is about Micaiah and the false prophets. Micaiah lived during the same time period as Jehoshaphat. In fact, this story takes place just before the one we were discussing. So Jehoshaphat is the king of Judah, and the king of Israel, whose name is Ahab, wants Jehoshaphat to come help him in a war with Syria. So they're talking about it, and Jehoshaphat, he wants to have a little bit of divine approval for this battle. So he says to Ahab, inquire first for the word of the Lord. So Ahab gathers together 400 prophets, and the 400 prophets all say, go up, for God will give the land into the hand of the king. But Jehoshaphat senses something's a little off. And he says, is there not here another prophet of the Lord of whom we may inquire? And it's kind of funny because there's already 400. But he's like, is there anyone else? Ahab admitted, there is yet one man by whom we may inquire of the Lord, Micaiah, the son of Imlah. But I hate him, for he never prophesies good concerning me, but always evil. That's the Old Testament version of a 1-star review on Google. Ahab knew who Micaiah was, but he despised him for speaking the truth. So instead of listening to God's word, Ahab would surround himself with prophets who would just tell him what he wanted to hear. But Jehoshaphat insists. So they send for Micaiah, and as Micaiah is being brought into the room, the messenger says, look, 400 of the prophets have already told the king to go to battle, so you better agree with them. Micaiah says, as the Lord lives, what my God says, that will I speak. So Ahab explains the situation, says, Micaiah, what should we do? Micaiah says, go up in triumph. They will be given into your hand. Now, the scriptures don't include a tone of voice, but I think that he was speaking sarcastically. Ahab himself could tell that something was off. He's like, come on, really? What's your real prophecy? And Micaiah says, okay, the real prophecy is Israel will be scattered on the mountains as the sheep that have no shepherd. Ahab turned to Jehoshaphat and said, did I not tell you he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil? And Micaiah went on to describe how a bunch of lying spirits had gone into those 400 false prophets. So Zedekiah, who is one of the false prophets, he slapped Micaiah on the face and said, which way did the Spirit of the Lord go from me to speak to you? Ahab orders Micaiah to be thrown into prison. Now think about Micaiah. All he's done is the right thing. He's been slapped on the face, thrown into prison. I think I would be discouraged, but Micaiah is still bold. Ahab says, I'll see you when I get back from battle. Micaiah says, if you return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me. So Ahab goes to battle. He disguises himself, hoping that the enemy won't be able to find him. But just like Adam and Eve's fig leaves weren't a good covering, Ahab's disguise didn't work. Ahab was killed in battle, his body was brought back to Samaria, and dogs licked up his blood. The end. Now, that's the end of the story as far as we know it, and at least as far as Ahab goes, we know what happened. But what happened to Micaiah? Was he ever let out of prison? Did Ahab's grandchildren ever come and say, hey, so sorry, like Grandpa should have listened to you? Did Zedekiah apologize? We don't know. And that silence is really powerful. It reminds us that sometimes in our lives, we might be courageous. We might speak God's word with terrible results. There's no apology, so far as we know, no happy ending for Micaiah. Now think about how hard his life was. It had to be difficult to get a 1-star review from the king when all you're doing is speaking God's word. How did Micaiah do it? I think that somewhere deep in his heart, he wasn't concerned about the king's review. He was concerned about the king's review. Today, we're in a world where there's 400 or more false prophets all around us, whispering the different words, the things that we want to hear. And our choice is the same as Ahab's. We can resist true prophets, try to disguise our disobedience, or we can listen to the prophets and follow their teachings. The crowd might never applaud our choice to follow God, but it doesn't really matter what they think. The only approval that counts is the Lord's. Now, I know that we know that in our heads, but how do we get it into our hearts? And I have 2 questions that I want you to think about. First, how can we remind ourselves that God's approval matters more than human recognition, especially if we're in a situation like Micaiah's, where earthly validation doesn't come? Question number 2, what does it look like in your life to respond like Micaiah when facing peer pressure?
So Max Lucado has written this book, You Are Special. Essentially, the idea is you have all these puppets that live in this town, and whenever they do something right, the people around them put a little star sticker on them. Whenever they do something wrong, they put a little black dot sticker on them. And so everyone has a variety of these stars and dots, but there's one character who's all covered with dots. And then he sees this other puppet who doesn't have anything on her. And when she does something right, someone goes to put a star on her, and it just falls right off. And when she does something wrong, someone goes to put a dot on her, and it falls right off too. And he wants to know, how'd you do that? And so she says, well, I'll take you to the person who taught me. And it's the person who made all these puppets. And it's obviously a metaphor for our relationship with God. It's just an important reminder of what other people think of you isn't nearly as important as what God thinks about you.
Yeah, I love that Max Lucado book, and trying to think about how do I get to the point in my life where the stickers just fall off, where it doesn't matter what other people think because it's so deep in my heart. I understand what God really thinks of me. Thank you. Now, the next story is one of my favorites, and it's a completely lesser-known story. We're going to go forward in time about 150 years to the story of Hezekiah's great Passover. So Hezekiah is a descendant of Jehoshaphat, and roughly 700 years before the birth of Christ, Hezekiah is the king of Judah, and he wanted to celebrate the Passover with all the tribes of Israel. Now, remember, at this point, you've got the 10 tribes in the north and only 2 tribes in the south. But Hezekiah invites everyone. He writes a letter saying, come for a special Passover. Some people refuse, but others accept. We read, some men of Asher, of Manasseh, and of Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. Now, just a quick side note. I don't know if you've ever been reading the Book of Mormon and you've learned that Lehi's from the tribe of Manasseh, And you're like, wait a second, that's kind of weird because he's living in Jerusalem. Shouldn't he be from the tribe of Judah? Well, there's a few times in the Old Testament, this is one of them, where people from the other tribes tend to migrate towards Jerusalem. So it's possible that Lehi's great-grandpa or somebody was here at Hezekiah's Passover. It was a really special occasion, but we read many of Ephraim and Manasseh and Issachar and Zebulun had not cleansed themselves. They did eat the Passover otherwise than it was written. In other words, some people made procedural errors during the Passover. This is the Old Testament. What do you think is going to happen to people who mess up the Passover? Yeah, that's what we're thinking. But Hezekiah has a different heart. He prayed for the people, saying, "The good Lord pardon everyone that prepareth his heart to seek God, though he be not cleansed according to the purification of the sanctuary." Some people made mistakes, but Hezekiah realized they're trying to do the best they can. Let's overlook this. And God hears Hezekiah's prayer. I love the phrase, "The good Lord pardon everyone that prepareth his heart to seek God." Adopting this attitude really can bring us peace. I want to tell you a story of a person I'll call Karen. She joined the church in her early 20s, and she'd only been a member for a few months. She's now married, living in a ward, and she's called to be the primary teacher. So she wants to be the greatest primary teacher ever. She invites all of the children over to play games. Now, when Karen was growing up, the game that she played with her family was poker. And she was astonished that none of her kids knew how to play. So she taught them. It was a great time. Can you imagine what the mothers of those primary children thought when they came home from the activity? What'd you do at primary? We played poker. Now, this is the classic situation where there could have been judgment or criticism, but I love that the people of Karen's ward had the spirit of the good Lord pardon everyone. They saw her heart. That didn't mean that they started giving out poker chips at the primary program, but there was room for love, and there's always room for love. Now, I gotta be honest, sometimes I'm a little nervous to teach the phrase, "the good Lord pardon everyone." Once I taught my teenage children this story, and a few days later, we were talking at the dinner table, and some of my children's friends were doing some pretty naughty things. And one of my kids said, "Well, the good Lord pardon everyone." And I was like, well, we gotta remember that the phrase, "the good Lord pardon everyone," doesn't mean anything goes. Hezekiah said, "The good Lord pardon everyone that prepareth his heart to seek God." Now, you and I, we can't look on the heart. God looks on the heart. So our role is to have that attitude, "the good Lord pardon everyone," towards others, and to prepare our own hearts to cultivate a heart that seeks God. Now, think about your own life. Do you have a story where you've seen the good Lord pardon everyone principle being used, or maybe should have been used?
I was trying to do a good thing, trying to help out someone, and I thought what I was doing would solve the problem, but it didn't solve the problem. It made things worse. It hurt this person's feelings really bad. I was feeling horrible, but I knew I just needed to say it because I just can't live like that. She needed to know that it was me, and when she found out it was me, she just said, "It's okay. I know your heart was right, and it's okay, don't worry about it." And the fact that she could just be so quick was so huge to me that she could pardon me.
Thank you.
This principle is very much instilled in us as temple workers to try to help every patron have a positive experience and not to feel so nervous that I'm not doing everything exactly as it needs to be done. And so if there's someone out there that's had an experience at the temple where they feel like, "I didn't do everything exactly right, I can't go back." Go back. There is nothing, there's little that invalidates temple ordinances. So go back. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to do everything exactly right. Just go back and enjoy the Spirit of the Lord.
Thank you. I want to just piggyback off that. I have an experience that one of my neighbors shared. I'll call her Ann. That's not her real name, but she was recently coming back into activity, and she received her endowment, and she enjoyed it, had a wonderful experience at the temple. She brought a friend who was coming back to activity to the temple. And while she was in the temple, bless this person's heart, there was a temple worker there who I'm sure had good intentions, but came up to her and criticized something that she had been doing in the temple. Normally, my friend Ann would have snapped back and been like, what are you talking about? Why are you criticizing me? But she was so filled with the love of Jesus, she just listened and was kind. And as she walked out of the temple with her friend said to her, Ann, what's happened to you? Like, you should have snapped back. Like, you're a different person. And Ann's like, yeah, it's Jesus. It's Jesus in my heart. I am a different person. The temple worker could have had the attitude of the good Lord pardon everyone, but I love that even when Anne had been mistreated, she still had it in her heart, the good Lord pardon everyone. Thank you for sharing that. Let's turn now to Hezekiah's tunnel. This is a modern miracle, but it starts out with an ancient problem. During the reign of Hezekiah, the same one that had the Passover, Judah faced one of its greatest threats. The Assyrian army had already scattered the 10 tribes and was marching to attack Judah. The chronicler records when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, had come and intended to fight against Jerusalem, he planned with his officers and his mighty men to stop the water of the springs that were outside the city. So obviously the city's survival depends on water, and if the Assyrians were able to access the water, that would help them and hurt Judah. So Hezekiah makes one of the boldest engineering decisions in the ancient world. He decides to build a tunnel from the spring so that all of the water will stay inside of the city walls and fall into the pool of Siloam, which was again enclosed inside the city walls. The chronicler says, this same Hezekiah closed the upper outlet of the waters of Gihon and directed them down to the west side of the city of David. And you can still go and visit it today. Archaeologically, all of these details are confirmed. You can walk down a series of steps. You can go through a 1/3 of a mile tunnel. Sometimes you're ankle deep, sometimes you're waist deep in water. It's still there today. It's a miracle of engineering, especially when you consider the workers started from 2 different sides and met in the middle. You can see today the actual inscription, well, a replica of the inscription that's more than 2,700 years old of where the people met. I can't even hang a picture in my house, let alone engineer things so that we meet in the middle of a 1/3 of a mile long tunnel. They also made it so the drop in elevation was only 12 inches. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Brother Hilton, this sounds amazing. I'm not going to go to Jerusalem this year, but I really wish I could take a tour of Hezekiah's tunnel. Wish granted. There are some great tours on YouTube, and I've linked to them in the course website, along with some other information about Hezekiah's tunnel. As cool as the engineering behind the tunnel is, I love the scriptural reason that's given for creating the tunnel. We read, a great many people were gathered, and they stopped all the springs and the brook that flowed through the land, saying, why should the kings of Assyria come and find much water? Hezekiah is saying, we can't control if the Assyrians come towards us or not, but we can control whether they have access to the life-giving water, to what sustains life. In our own day, we can think of the Assyrians as representing enemies we face, maybe the enemies of our own laziness, or the enemies of addiction, or temptation, discouragement. The water could represent our time and our hearts. So just like Hezekiah asks, why should the Assyrians come here and find water? We could ask, why should temptation steal my time at night? Time God could be using to refresh me in prayer. Why should resentment about past mistakes take up my thoughts when Christ is telling me to look to Him? So think about your own life. When you think about your time, attention, or energy, where are the Assyrians drinking from your well? And how could you redirect that water back inside the city walls? It worked for Hezekiah, in part because of the tunnel and in part because of other miracles the Lord did. The Assyrians were not able to defeat Jerusalem. How do we get it so where the Assyrians we face don't have access to our lives, to our time? Now today we've seen 5 stories, and each of them is a shadow pointing to Christ. Asa trusted, then turned away, but Jesus trusted to the end. Jehoshaphat said, our eyes are on you. Jesus is the God Jehoshaphat's eyes were on. Micaiah was struck for speaking truth. Christ was struck for being the truth. Hezekiah said, the good Lord pardon everyone. Jesus is the good Lord who pardons those who seek Him. Hezekiah hid water from his enemy. Jesus gives us the water that no enemy can steal. All of Chronicles whispers His name. And in the final words of Chronicles, we see another echo of the Savior. Both Kings and Chronicles describe the destruction of Jerusalem, but their endings, the last words, are different. The final lines of 2 Kings 25 talk about the king of Judah, King Jehoiakim. He's in exile in Babylon. So Jerusalem's destroyed, the king is in exile, and the final words say, the king of Babylon graciously freed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. And he spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. And every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table, and a regular allowance was given him by the king according to his daily needs as long as he lived. It's kind of a cliffhanger. The credits are rolling and we don't know what's going to happen. Is there a restoration? We don't know. But the final lines of Chronicles are different. After recounting the fall of Jerusalem, Chronicles closes with a word from King Cyrus of Persia. We read, "Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Let any of those among you who are of his people, may the Lord their God be with them, go up." Do you see the difference? Kings ends in exile. Chronicles ends with the invitation to return. Kings ends with us sitting at the table of a foreign king, wondering what's going to happen next. Will God's promises really be fulfilled? Chronicles ends with the call to rebuild. It's a new chapter. It's a divine to be continued. God hasn't finished his story. He's going to begin again. And he can begin again in our lives as well. That's why I love the final two words of Chronicles, go up. Remember, in the original Hebrew Bible, the Bible as it is in Hebrew, Chronicles is the last book. So we have a different order in the Christian Bible. But if we were just reading the Hebrew Bible, the final words we would read don't end in despair, but in hope. Go up. Now, there's something, though, it's a little detail, it's kind of strange about the ending of Chronicles. The ending is smoothed out frequently in English translations, but if we were to look at the original Hebrew text, it starts with the word and. So the final sentence would be something like, may the Lord their God be with them and go up. And it's sort of like an incomplete sentence. It should be, and go up to what? Go up to Jerusalem, go up to rebuild the temple. And scholars suggest that it actually ends with this disruptive way on purpose. It's like the chronicler is saying to the reader, now it's your turn. And you go up. Now it's time for your restoration. Because in a sense, each of us could be seen as being in exile or captivity. Maybe it's a captivity of sadness or discouragement. Maybe we're feeling captive to some hard things that have happened to us or to people we love or things that we wish were different. But we don't have to turn to Cyrus for deliverance because a truer, better Cyrus has already made the way home for us a reality. Jesus Christ has said, come unto me and I will give you rest. Christ can rebuild what's been broken. He's just calling you and me to leave Babylon and come home. It's time for us to go up.